New York City, 1931. The Big Apple had just been shaken to its core by the Castellammarese War, and change was on the horizon. Salvatore Maranzano, also known as Little Caesar, had just triumphed over Joe The Boss Masseria, former leader of the Genovese Crime Family. Masseria formerly controlled Mafia operations throughout the United States in the 1920s, but his time was coming to a bloody end. Maranzano was poised to strike, his forces armed and ready. What happened next saw a restructure of power across the whole of the Mafia and the introduction of the infamous 5 families. In today's video, we will be taking a look at the key events surrounding the Castellammarense War, before investigating the key figures and leaders involved, as well as the notorious families that would establish control in the wake of the fighting. It's a violent and tumultuous tale that throws us right into the heart of 1930s New York. The struggle would go on to inspire Francis Ford Coppola's legendary Godfather films, and is a tale unlike any other in Mafia history. Join us as we meet the 5 families. To understand the 5 families, we need to examine the events that allowed them to rise to power. It all started with Salvatore Maranzano. Maranzano, who was born in the town of Castellamare del Golfo in Sicily, started out as a Cosa Nostra boss on Sicily itself, but set his sights on New York City during the 1920s. Maranzano was known for his domineering presence and controlling atmosphere, and had become considerably well respected in the criminal underworld. His fascination with the Roman Empire, and specifically Julius Caesar, would lead to the rise of his nickname, Little Caesar. Maranzano emigrated to the United States with power in his sights, as well as the physical means of taking it. The notorious Sicilian mafioso, Don Vito Cascioferro, had backed him to seize operations overseas. When he arrived in Brooklyn, Maranzano established a legitimate operation as a real estate broker, using it as a front for his bootlegging business on the down low. From here, his miniature empire grew. He would soon find himself taking flowing income from prostitution as well as drug smuggling. There was only one problem. Joe Masseria, the boss himself, was well established in New York as the boss of the Morello crime family. Not only was Masseria notably ruthless and successful, he had also survived assassination attempts and retaliated violently against the assailants. Gangsters across the city knew him as the man who can dodge bullets. He wasn't to be taken lightly. Maranzano and Masseria soon became rivals, and operations against one another's businesses soon became common. Gangsters from opposing factions would hijack alcohol trucks to make money during Prohibition. As this became a more frequent occurrence, tensions reached their boiling point. Covert operations to kill gangsters from both factions would soon be carried out, which led to Maranzano taking action. The Castellammarese War began in February of 1930, when Mafia gunmen under the command of both Masseria and Maranzano began openly fighting in the streets of New York. Maranzano was the first to declare war, but notable gangsters were killed on either side. The first major casualty was Giuseppe Morello, one of Masseria's enforcers. He was killed by Maranzano's loyalists on the 15th of August 1930 in a bloody ambush. This was followed 2 weeks later by the death of another one of Masseria's trusted men, Joseph Pinzolo, who was killed in a Times Square office by members of the Reina family, who had recently sworn loyalty to Maranzano. Masseria retaliated by killing Joe Aiello on the 23rd of October 1930. Aiello was the president of the Chicago Unione Siciliane, a high-profile figure in Italian society within New York, and was a close ally of Maranzano. Aiello's death was not in vain. Maranzano retaliated once more by killing Steve Ferrigno, a key member of the Morello crime family, who specialized in theft and extortion at the Brooklyn waterfront's docks. Knowing that they could be next, prominent gangsters on Masseria's side began pledging their allegiance to Maranzano. One by one, Masseria's key gunmen, advisors, and sources of income were dropping in number. The situation was looking dire for him by the start of 1931. One of the most important losses to Masseria's side was the defection of Charles Lucky Luciano to Maranzano's faction. Luciano met with Maranzano to offer him a deal. Luciano would offer his services in murdering Masseria, and in return, Maranzano would mark the end of the Castellammarese War. The leader agreed to Luciano's terms, and on the 15th of April, 1931, Masseria was killed in a Coney Island restaurant by multiple gunmen during a game of cards. Masseria's murder went unpunished in New York. The gunmen could not be reliably identified, and Luciano was able to provide an alibi. Maranzano fulfilled his end of the agreement, and the Castellammarese War died with Masseria. It was up to Maranzano, as the victor in this feud, to structure the Mafia within New York City as he saw fit. It was his decision in this moment that led to the forming of the five families. Men that had proved invaluable to him during the war were chosen to become the leaders of five individual Mafia factions within the city. Each faction was led first and foremost by a boss, who would report to Maranzano and oversee the day-to-day workings of the faction. An underboss would subsequently provide support to the boss, while a consigliere would act as an advisor. The underboss would be in charge of the capo regimes, or capos, underneath him. Capos were in turn the heads of a regime of soldiers that would work on the ground, running criminal enterprises and acting as gunmen if the need arose. At the bottom were the associates, individuals that were generally affiliated with the Mafia. Associates could come from anywhere in the city, as long as they were loyal to their family, while individuals in the higher ranks needed to be made men. Usually this meant that they either needed to be full-blooded Italian Americans or had to be sponsored by another made man. The five leaders that would be assigned to act as the bosses for their respective crime families under Maranzano's rule were Maranzano himself, Charles Lucky Luciano, Joseph Profaci, Vincent Mangano, and Thomas Gagliano. These names were announced just after Masseria had been killed, and these men instantly became some of the most powerful gangsters in America's criminal underworld. The bosses were soon called to a meeting in Wappingers Falls, New York, where Maranzano declared himself the capo di tutti capi, the boss of all bosses. His reign, however, would be short-lived. It wouldn't take long for Luciano to turn on the boss of all bosses. From his perspective, Maranzano was becoming greedier and more controlling than Masseria was, and he wasn't prepared to stand for it. Maranzano caught wind of a potential attempt by Luciano to double-crosses him early in September 1931, and actually hired Vincent Mad Dog Call, an Irish gangster, to kill him. Luciano struck first, however, and would soon order the murder of Maranzano, which took place on the 10th of September 1931 in his Manhattan office. His murderers were Samuel Red Levine, Bo Weinberg, and Bugsy Siegel. Breaking into his office, the team of triggermen ended his life with a flurry of stab wounds and gunshots. The boss was dead, but the five families would continue to reign. With Maranzano out of the picture, Luciano set to work on reshifting the balance of power one more. He called a meeting with all the most prominent gangsters in the area to convene in Chicago. There was some speculation that Luciano would declare himself the boss of all bosses at this meeting, so you can imagine the surprise when he abolished the title altogether. Luciano believed that having a boss of all bosses would create a never-ending power struggle amongst the five families, and if he was to declare himself capo de tutti capo in Maranzano's wake, he would live his life with a constant target on his back. Instead, he created a system that would let him slyly retain the power he already held over the five families, whilst encouraging order and cooperation with the gangsters of New York City. He therefore created the Commission, with the approval of the other four family bosses in attendance. The Commission was set up to oversee Mafia activity, not only in New York, but across the wider United States. It would consist of a board of governors who could mediate conflicts between families or individuals, ensuring that peace was kept between factions who could easily turn on others and upset the balance of power without regulation. On the board of directors sat all 5 bosses of the newly founded crime families: Joe Bonnano in place of Maranzano, as well as Luciano, Mangano, Galliano, and Profaci. Also heading up the commission was the legendary Chicago outfit boss Al Capone and the Buffalo family boss Stefano Magaddino. Luciano was appointed chairman of the commission and would agree to convene every 5 years. Meetings could also be brought forward with short notice if an immediate disagreement needed to be dealt with. The commission still stands today as the governing body presiding over the Mafia. Its subsequent meetings have faced police investigations, assassination attempts, and large-scale trials in court, but has managed to persist. Gangsters from over 20 crime families are currently represented by the commission, with several more families having been represented and dismissed throughout the years. Now let's take a look at the original bosses of the 5 families that composed the commission and their role in the Italian-American Mafia in the years that followed. Salvatore Maranzano himself was supposed to lead what would become the Bonnano crime family until his death in 1931. Control over the family was subsequently passed to Joe Bonnano when Luciano set up the commission, and the eponymous name arose from the ashes of the Maranzano family. Bonnano, at just 26 years of age, was evidently the right man for the job, as between 1931 and the mid-1960s, the Bonnano family were one of the most prominent and successful mafia groups in America. One of the Bonnano family's secrets to success was the close ties it maintained with the original Sicilian Mafia back in Europe. Using this relationship, Bonnano and his men were able to traffic billions of dollars worth of heroin, cocaine, and weapons into the United States as part of a transatlantic network of illegal trade. Bonnano's influence didn't just reach Italy, however. His network soon expanded into illegal gambling and loan sharking, with clients and allies as far west as California. As much as he was ready and willing to take the reins from the deceased Maranzano, the two had a lot in common. Bonnano believed in the old Italian Mafia traditions of respect, honor, and dignity. He was something of a relic in the Mafia world despite his young age, and was one of the few bosses in the 1930s who actively focused on upholding these old ways. His family were close-knit, and he put a heavy emphasis on blood ties and bonds. He also developed a strong relationship with fellow 5 families boss Joe Profaci. Bonnano's son married Profaci's niece in 1956, which strengthened his position in the commission. When Profaci died in 1962, however, this relationship faltered. Upon Profaci's death, Bonnano felt threatened by rising crime boss Carlo Gambino and faced backlash from his own family about his persistent absence. He started to spend a lot more time in Arizona, away from New York's Mafia affairs, where he secretly plotted to assassinate several of his newly perceived rivals within the commission. Gambino was at the top of his hit list, as well as Stefano Magaddino, another 5 families boss. He managed to retain a semblance of a relationship with Profaci's successor, Joseph Magliocco, with whom he intended to overthrow the leaders of the commission. Magliocco was double-crossed by one of his own hitmen, however, and the plot failed. The leading members of the commission were quick to scout Bonnano out as the assailant, which led Bonnano to go into hiding in Montreal, Canada. The commission ultimately spared Magliocco's life, but forced him to resign as the Profaci family boss. The remainder of Bonnano's life was tumultuous at best. He disappeared for a period of 2 years following his time in hiding, which led to the ascension of Gaspar Di Gregorio as head of the Bonnano family. Bonnano would ultimately agree to retire as a boss and move to Arizona permanently in 1968. Here, he faced mounting pressure from law enforcement as his crimes caught up with him, and he was sentenced to 5 years in prison in 1981. While in prison, his health deteriorated, but he managed to persist until May 11, 2002, at the old age of 97. The Bonnano family still persists, however, and is currently headed by Michael "The Nose" Mancuso. Mancuso is a notorious gangster who has served multiple lengthy prison stretches for murder and manslaughter, and was most recently released in March 2019. Joe Profaci, a former Cosa Nostra boss, ruled over the Profaci family for a successful 3 decades from 1928 up until his death in 1962. Like Bonnano, he attempted to uphold traditional Mafia values in his acts of criminality, which ranged from orchestrating protection rackets to extorting businesses and wealthy individuals across New York. Throughout the entirety of his rule, he maintained his legitimate olive oil business, Mamma Mia Importing Company, which gave him his nickname, the Olive Oil King. His business raked money in while his profits surmounted from illegal means on the side, which led to him becoming an exceedingly wealthy man by the end of the 1930s. He owned over 20 businesses across New York, which employed hundreds of people. At his peak, he had a personal net worth of over $300 million. That's equivalent, in purchasing power, to over $5.5 billion today. Despite being a ruthless and scheming gangster, Profaci was noted for his charitable behavior across his career. He was a devout practicing Catholic and was put forward for a knighthood in 1949 by a group of New York Catholics. He would have got it too if the Brooklyn district attorney didn't step in at the last moment. He would often make generous donations to Catholic organizations and charities and invited local priests to his sprawling estate for Mass. So religious was Profaci that he once ordered his men to kill a thief who had stolen jeweled crowns from the Regina Paz's votive shrine in Brooklyn in 1952. This generosity was not noticed by his own men, however, who often complained of his miserly, selfish nature. Profaci demanded a tithe, $25 a month, from each of his men, which was supposed to be donated to the families of imprisoned gangsters. Instead, Profaci reportedly hoarded the money for himself, which accounted for around $50,000 a year. Profaci's hold on his family waned as he reached the final years of his life. 4 of his top mobsters were kidnapped in 1961 by Joseph Crazy Joe Gallo. Profaci himself escaped capture and managed to negotiate the release of all hostages shortly after. By 1962, he was seriously ill. Carlo Gambino attempted to convince him to step down as boss, but Profaci remained vigilantly against the idea until the end. He ultimately died in June of 1962 from aggressive cancer of the liver. Joseph Magliocco succeeded him until his plot to overthrow the commission backfired, and the commission replaced him with Joseph Colombo. As of today, the Profaci family is known as the Colombo family. Lovingly nicknamed Vincent the Executioner, Vincent Mangano initially led the Mineo family, which was renamed the Mangano family upon the creation of the 5 families. He was notable for controlling the waterfronts of New York City during his time as a boss, where he extorted money from shipping companies. When cargo ships brought goods into New York's docks, men from the Mangano family would be there to meet them, demanding tribute in exchange for safe passage into the city. This worked both ways, and Mangano was able to make a great deal of money from extorting those loading and unloading goods. He managed to recruit Anthony Anastasio into his ranks, an important member considering he was president of the International Longshoremen's Association. With Anastasio at his side, Mangano was very successful in his early years as a leader. Mangano's career was, however, tumultuous and relatively short. He often argued with his underboss, Albert Anastasia, who was particularly close with Luciano. Luciano would often seek out Anastasia's services and opinion without consulting Mangano, which angered the mob boss. Combined with disagreements on the way their business was run, Anastasia and Mangano often found themselves in heated, raging verbal spats, which almost turned physical on several occasions. It may have been these disagreements that led to the eventual downfall and disappearance of Mangano. On April 19, 1951, after 20 years of rule, Mangano disappeared. That very same day, his brother's body was found at Sheepshead Bay, Brooklyn, thought to have been murdered on orders issued by Albert Anastasia himself. It was instantly considered that Vincent Mangano may have suffered the same fate, but his body was never found, and he remains lost to the world to this day. In 1961, the Brooklyn Surrogates Court declared Mangano dead, but nobody has ever been arrested in connection to his disappearance or his brother's murder. Anastasia was the #1 suspect, but if he did it, he certainly got off the hook. In 1957, Carlo Gambino took control of the Mangano crime family, and the organization continues to bear his name today. They are still active in the New York metropolitan area, but their focus has shifted towards a general array of financial crimes, including, but not limited to, fraud, hijacking, loan sharking, illegal gambling, and racketeering. Luciano was perhaps the most essential man in the creation of the 5 families outside of Salvatore Maranzano. Due to his role in the establishment of the Commission, he has been heralded as the father of the Italian-American Mafia and is considered to be a legendary name amongst its ranks. He was a notoriously resilient gangster, even before the creation of the 5 families. He survived a severe beating in 1929 after refusing to work for another Mafia leader, and was arrested 25 times from 1916 to 1936. His charges included robbery, assault, illegal gambling, and blackmail. He was instrumental in the flow of alcohol across New York during Prohibition, and soon became the most powerful man in the American Mafia following the downfall of Maranzano in 1931. The Luciano family engaged in a variety of high-stakes crimes across New York under Lucky's reign, including extortion, loan sharking, drug trafficking, and bookmaking. Like Mangano, he focused on waterfronts, turning his attention to Manhattan to exploit the constant flow of goods. After making himself the chairman of the commission when it was founded, Luciano wisely operated as quietly as he could, forging subtle and secret alliances with other crime bosses to afford himself as many allies as possible. He was good to his most loyal men, promoting them into positions of immense power within his family. Even those that were non-Italians were offered roles as Luciano's close advisors and were closely trusted, something that rarely occurred in other families. In 1936, however, life took a turn for Luciano. Following a raid on over 200 brothels across Manhattan and Brooklyn, Luciano was arrested on 90 counts of compulsory prostitution. Luciano's legal team did everything they could to prevent him from facing charges, but even bribes of over $50,000 didn't set him free. In April 1936, he was brought back to New York to face trial, having been charged with every offense. Throughout the trial, Luciano was also brought for perjury, and the prosecution questioned his dubious income tax records. In the end, he was found guilty of 62 offenses and was sentenced to 30 to 50 years in prison. While imprisoned at Sing Sing Correctional Facility and Clinton Correctional Facility, Luciano continued to act as boss of his family. He used his influence in prison to help get the materials to build a church on the inside, whilst attempting to constantly appeal his sentence. His last appeal was put forward in 1938, at which point the Supreme Court refused to entertain his requests any longer. His sentence was commuted after the outbreak of World War II, which saw Luciano loosen his stranglehold on the docks of Manhattan, alongside providing any intel he could to local government regarding naval intelligence. Upon his release in January 1946, Luciano was released and deported back to Italy. Aside from a brief stint in Cuba where he attempted to regain control over Mafia operations in the Americas, he spent the rest of his life in Sicily under close police surveillance. On January 26, 1962, he died of a heart attack whilst on his way to consult a film crew about making a biopic of his life. The Luciano family is now known as the Genovese family, after Luciano's close associate Vito Genovese took power in 1957. Today, they are headed up by Liborio Salvatore Bellomo, who maintains a low profile following his release from prison in 2008. The final organization within the 5 families was initially headed up by Tommy Galliano, a man who kept a significantly lower profile than his contemporaries throughout his time in power. This may have been on account of the prison sentence he served shortly after becoming boss in 1932, where he served 15 months in Atlanta Penitentiary for tax evasion. Upon his release, he took steps to plan to secure his position, especially during Luciano's lengthy stint in prison for prostitution. While Luciano was in prison, the commission was co-chaired by Galliano, Mangano, Bonnano, Profaci, and Stefano Magaddino. Taking care not to overstep the mark and end up with a target on his back, he instead opted to turn most of his attention towards maintaining ties with the Cosa Nostra gangsters in America and Europe. The Galliano family worked mainly in the movement and exploitation of goods. Galliano's men took control of gasoline rationing, as well as black market sugar and meat. His men dominated these industries and imposed extortionate fees on the trade of such items. Preferring to keep a low profile, Galliano was rarely seen giving orders directly and preferred to operate through his closest advisors. Gaetano Lucchese was one such spokesperson for Galliano, who essentially acted as the family's figurehead during the boss's reign. Capos would often report to Lucchese rather than Galliano directly, and he remains one of the most enigmatic prominent figures in Mafia history. Following his 1932 stint in prison, little is known of Galliano's life and work. His death was only announced through Lucchese in 1951 at a Senate hearing on organized crime. He reportedly died of natural causes, and his body is currently housed in a private mausoleum in the Bronx, New York. Unsurprisingly, following Galliano's death, power transferred to Lucchese. The family was soon renamed the Genovese Crime Family, and Galliano's former right-hand man continued to oversee the day-to-day running of the organization up until his own death, caused by a brain tumor in 1967. Unlike Galliano, a big spectacle was made of his death, and thousands attended his funeral. Everyone from drug dealers and pimps to politicians and policemen. Today, the family is headed up by Victor Amuso, otherwise known as the Deadly Don. Notoriously violent, Amuso is currently serving a life sentence for murder at the Federal Correctional Complex in Butner, North Carolina. He formerly acted as an enforcer for the family throughout the 1960s and beyond, officially becoming a made man in 1977. The man whose murder he currently sits in prison for, Anthony Luongo, was his former employer, and Amuso's last barrier to complete control of the Lucchese family. While the five families continue to persist in New York City today, they don't hold as much sway or power as they used to in the early days of the commission. The families reached their absolute peak of power in the 1940s to early 1950s, but from there on out, it was a slow decline. In 1970, the United States introduced the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, which intentionally targeted the Mafia by cracking down on organized crime. Many gangsters were arrested under the law and subsequently became police informants to help track down and stamp out additional Mafia activity in the city. Today, the leaders of the five families run their organizations stealthily and with due caution. The legendary power held by the likes of Luciano and Maranzano may simply not be attainable in today's world. Despite the waning influence of the Mafia in the real world, they hold a near mythical status in fiction. In Francis Ford Coppola's 1972 epic The Godfather, five crime families, the Corleones, the Barzinis, the Tattaglias, the Cunios, and the Strachis, act as dominant forces in the constant power struggle for dominion over their Mafia empires. It's no secret that the film was directly inspired by the events surrounding and following the Castellammarense War and the establishment of the five families. Today, it remains the most universally beloved piece of Mafia-related media, and with good reason. The story that inspired it is certainly an iconic one,